I brought you the coffee filter,
Okay. Now with all of you here, we can get started. Today we have Dr. Bixby here. He's the director of writing services in the Graduate College. He's here to talk workshop on writing an abstract. Just to remind you, we're expecting all of you to write abstracts of your research. At the end of the session, we can go to a conference or something with the fall or early spring. So this would help you a lot to write a good abstract. So with that,
Sure. Hi, good afternoon. Good to see everyone. Could I just quickly go around the room and hear where y'all are from, what your host universities are? You can say your name and your home university. I'll start in the front and go around.
My name is Jamil Tullah. I'm from St. Augustine University in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Great, thank you.
Carter Kaler, Southern Methodist University, Dallas, Texas.
Walker Cherry, Norfolk State University in Norfolk, Virginia.
Thank you.
Jerry Boggs, University of Kentucky.
Yeah, during Winston-Salem State.
Oh, very good. We'll go across this way now. Yeah.
Emmanuel Terrell from Livingstone College in Salisbury, North Carolina.
Great.
Cameron Evangelista from North Carolina State University in Raleigh.
Haley Muller from Mississippi College in Clinton, Mississippi.
Eric Fagan from NC State University in Raleigh.
Citrona Patterson from Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi.
Thank you.
Adasia Nelson from Jacksonville State University in Jacksonville, Alabama.
Kennedy Garrett from Savannah State University in Savannah, Georgia.
Great. Yeah, it's just good to hear kind of the spread where folks are from. That's great. All right, so as stated, I'm Dr. Shea Bigsby. I work with the Graduate College here at North Carolina A&T. And in my role, I work with students who are doing a master's thesis or doctoral dissertation. That's one of my main areas that I'm responsible for. So today we're going to talk about some of the components of an effective research abstract. And by the end of the session, you'll have seen some examples and you'll be able to kind of break them down into their components so you can then apply this when you're developing your own research abstracts. So before we get into abstracts as such, I want to start with a couple of points about the relationship between science and writing or communication. And this is a nice point that I've seen and I like it and I adapted it slightly. But the idea that as a scientist, you are in fact a professional writer and or communicator. It may not be the way you think of yourself normally. You may not think my role is to write, my role is to communicate. But ultimately that is what you need to do. And you need to do it effectively as a scientist because you need to be able to share your results. You need to be able to compare results and compare methods with other researchers. And in that sense, you really are a professional writer and communicator. Now, going along with that, as you may well begin to understand from experience, to improve at writing, there are some things you have to do. You have to study writing and you have to practice writing. So like anything, I mean, writing is a skill and it's an ever-developing skill. The best writers get better as they continue to practice and study. And what we're going to do today is going to be a little bit more on the side of studying writing. And so what I'm going to have you do is look at the components of abstracts, apply those to specific abstracts. In other words, you're going to actually break down and study a piece of writing in a way that might be something different than what you've done before. All right, so moving on to the subject at hand, when we talk about research abstracts, we all have a sense of what they are. Of course, they're a short summary of either completed or proposed research. So it's a short, often very short, as we'll see, can be 5 sentences, 7 sentences. Usually they're under 200 words. There are different limitations in certain publication venues. But it's a short summary that ties together all these components of what your research is or what your proposed research will be. Now, again, you know this, but I'm just going to kind of remind us. So there are various places where you might use abstracts in kind of a scientific setting. Certainly, they're tied to journal articles. So of course, if you look at any academic journal, every single paper has an abstract you can quickly scan. You can quickly read this short 5-sentence summary of that article and do the same for each of the articles. And you can use that to help you decide which articles are worth reading in more depth, which ones are applicable to your topic. The abstract serves a very important purpose because it's probably the most likely thing that's going to be read from any of your work. People are much more likely to look at your abstract and maybe decide whether or not your work is something they need to delve into in further detail. Similarly, if you're applying for research grants, you're submitting a full proposal, but you're also outlining the contours, summarizing the main points of your proposed project for a research grant. Certainly, if you're doing a master's thesis or doctoral dissertation, you develop an abstract as part of that. You've developed this long research document, and now you're going to pull out the summary, the abstract, proposals for presentations, book chapters, et cetera. So pretty much any academic venue we're going to be presenting research, you will usually be required, in fact, to also write a short summary of your research in the form of an abstract. All right, so we know what they are, of course, but let's talk about what makes a research abstract effective. And as you'll see, we're going to come back to these points when we look at some examples later on. So I want you to kind of get the big picture, and then we'll look at it and try to apply this to some, I think, effective examples of abstracts. So if you're going to write an effective abstract, here's some things you want to keep in mind. You want to make sure it's brief. Now, in part, that's because it's a requirement. I mean, most abstracts for a journal article are going to be under 250 words strictly, and some even shorter than that. It might be under 200 words. The ones we're going to look at today are roughly, they're about 150 words each. And so you'll see how much you can do in a pretty short space of time. But because it's so brief, you have to use your words wisely, right? You can't go on and on the first part, and then it turns out you haven't even gotten to what you actually meant to say. You don't have time for that. You don't have space for that in an abstract. So you have to be brief, and you have to use your words carefully. You also need to be clear and logical in your mode of presentation. And the way I would put it, and I think you'll see this applies in the examples we'll look at, is that you want to be able to get your main points across even to someone who's not an expert in your field of study. So while the technical terminology, while the jargon, while the exact methods might only apply to someone in your field, the general flow of the ideas needs to be comprehensible to any reader or any educated reader. And so again, if it's clear and it's logical in the sequence of phrases, sentences, and so on, anybody can get the main points, and that's going to be critical. You want to make sure you're using keywords and phrases that align with your intended audience and purpose. Now that applies to some extent with any piece of writing, but what I mean in the context of an abstract is this. If, for instance, you want to be focused on a certain sub area in your field of study, you want to use those buzzwords that are big in your field so that other researchers who are looking at the abstract will see it and they'll say, oh, I know what this is connected to. I know the kind of area that this person's studying. So in other words, it's the key, might be the keywords, the search terms that are related to your area of study. You want to make sure you use those carefully to make sure you're getting across the right message to the intended audience. And this is the piece we're going to go in a little bit more detail on. You want to make sure your abstract, even though it's very brief, is in fact comprehensive. And what I mean by that is it has to cover a little bit of everything from the whole research project. It has to give somebody an idea of the background, a little bit of what you did, your methodology, what your results were, and why your results might matter. And so the terms we're going to use to look through this are these components of the research. We're going to talk about the motivation and or problem statement. We're going to talk about the methods and approach. We'll talk about the results, and we'll talk about the conclusion and implications. So to dive into each of those in more detail, let's think about what this means. Now, these are relevant to any length of research project, right? These are things you're doing in a full journal article. These are things you're doing in a conference presentation. But even in an abstract, in the short 150-word summary, you're really going to hit all these points. And again, we'll see how that applies in just a moment. So first, you want to think about your motivation or your problem statement, which may or may not be directly connected. So the first question you should ask is, why do we care? Why should the reader care about the problem you're addressing? Why is this of interest? Why is this notable? A good way to remind yourself to keep that in mind is to say, why should anyone care? Why should anyone care about this research? Going along with that, on a more kind of field-specific orientation, you can say, well, what problem are you trying to solve? What is the problem in your area, or what is the problem technologically, or what is the problem societally that you're trying to address with your research? And also in this kind of cluster, we're thinking about things like the scope of your work. So you're kind of giving them a sense, how broad are you going? Are you going to affect, the entire field of, computer chip design, or are you trying to help streamline some particular process within the field? So you give a sense of what are the impacts, what are the things this is connected to, and then how deep am I going in my research? Obviously, in scientific research, one of the main things you're doing is talking about your methods, your approach. What is it you actually did to address that problem? So you've established that there is a problem, there is a reason to be concerned about that problem. What are you actually doing? How did you go about solving or making progress on that problem? What methods did you use? What kinds of things were you using? Were you using simulation, analytic models, so on and so forth? And then going along with the point we said about scope previously, what is the extent of your work? How broad did you go? Did you do, how many trials did you do? How many different approaches did you take within this research, right? So you want to give a sense of that. Obviously, following from the methods, you want to dive into your results to some extent. What did you actually discover? What were the things that were derived from this research? And then finally, you want to make sure you don't forget, even in an abstract, to include some information on conclusions and implications. What are the takeaways? What is it you want somebody to take away from the research you've done? What are the implications of this work for your field, for some specific sub-area, or maybe for technological applications? Why might this actually make a difference in the field moving forward? So really, these are the components that you want to keep in mind when you're writing an abstract. And what you might do, if you want to keep it really simple, is you could kind of use this as a kind of checklist. You can say to yourself, okay, I need to write an abstract. I know I have 150 words. I'm going to write 1 or 2 sentences on the motivation and problem area. I'm going to write 1 or 2 sentences summarizing what I did, 1 or 2 sentences on results, 1 sentence on conclusion implications. And that's really it. That's all you have space for. But if you omit any of these pieces, it'll weaken your abstract. Your abstract will not have everything it needs to get the points across to your academic community. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass around some sample abstracts, and we're going to actually look at them in the context of what we're talking about. So we're going to actually dive into them, break them down to their components, and see how well this model maps onto them. And in doing so, I think you'll start to see how you can begin to use this as kind of like a template or a model in writing your own abstract. I'm just going to send 2 more with you. You should pass them back as well. All right, so as they're passed around and as everyone gets a copy, the first thing we'll do is we'll look at abstract number 1. And I want you to take a couple minutes to read it to yourself. And I want you to think about what we've talked about so far. So before you start reading, how well does it do all these things? That it maintains kind of a brief but still clear and comprehensive approach. How does it, for instance, get the points across even in a way a non-expert can understand? That's going to be important because you may or may not have any familiarity with this exact content. And then how well does it hit on these areas? So start by just reading it, and we'll go from there. And so as I mentioned, just stick to the first one for now so we can really dive into it. All right, so now what I want you to do is take that same abstract, and I want you to break it down in these components that we just talked about. So where do you see each of these things? So you can look at it sentence by sentence, more or less. Look at each sentence, try to figure out which of these things it most closely aligns with. And again, it doesn't really matter if you understand what the methods are or what the results mean. It's rather, how does the writer make it clear which of these areas each of these sentences fits into. So actually reread it and make a note or something, break it down so we can then bring it back to the discussion and work through it. And this falls under the studying writing kind of piece that I talked about at the beginning. This is where you're actually going to take a piece of writing, break it down to its pieces, to its components, and thereby understand it better. So see what you make of it. Just to help us out, I have it broken down sentence by sentence. Now, it's not going to be big enough. I want you to be able to see this as well. Just so you can see on the left the way the sentences break down. And then on the right, we'll still be able to look at the components that we're observing or looking for. All right, so let's bring it back as a kind of discussion. In looking at this abstract, I mean, how well did you find it mapped onto these components, or vice versa? How well did these components map onto this abstract? Were you able to find all of them? Could you figure out where each sentence falls? All right, so let's just actually look at it. Let's actually dive in a way that we might not normally do. in reading an abstract. So look at the first sentence. It talks about the treatment with these NO donors. What is the point being made? Is regarded as being effective against osteoporosis. What are they doing in that sentence? What has been established? Which category did you put it in?
Motivation.
Yeah. Why does it help somebody see the motivation?
Because it sort of establishes like the current state of the art.
Yeah.
It establishes the reason to why we need to do the steps in here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's why the point, why should anyone care, is often worth keeping at the front of your mind. So here you can immediately understand it. Even if you don't know anything about this area of research, you say, wow, effective against osteoporosis. That has immediate kind of comprehensibility to any reader. Anybody says, I see why this matters. We can make a difference in some kind of health in some kind of health outcome or have an impact in people's health. That's immediately motivating. And I think you're right. I mean, that's why I kind of put these together, motivation, problem statement. They kind of blur together. It's kind of a little bit of both. Because obviously, if you're talking about the motivation, you're going to be explaining what is the problem. So what about the second sentence? Now, notice what they do here. So it says treatment with these things is regarded as being effective. However, so the word however is a perfect transitional word here. It tells you immediately that you've now moved into a problem. You've laid out the background that's relevant, but you're now saying, however, there's a problem. There's something missing. There's something lacking. So, of course, they go on to specify NO has a short half-life, limiting its clinical usefulness. Again, I think anybody can understand the flow of these sentences. It makes perfect sense how the first sentence sets up the background and then the second sentence shows us what remains a problem. All right, so what happens next? What do you make of if you use the numbering or just in looking at the next, I don't know, few sentences? What seems to happen there?
It's kind of all just methodology.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think what you're going to see in this case, it almost literally follows the sequence that we laid out here. It starts with the motivation, the problem statement. It then talks about methodology. It then talks about results. It then is going to talk about conclusion. So it does almost exactly this layout that we've looked at. But you're right. So the next couple sentences certainly are really about methodology. So they say to overcome this, and notice, I mean, it's very simple, but it really makes a difference. Just by using that phrase, to overcome this limitation, you know exactly what they're going to say. Whatever it is that they've done, you know that their method is one way to overcome the problem mentioned in the previous sentence. So again, just look at the way that a simple transitional word, however, or a simple phrase, to overcome this limitation, sets up the logic of the sentence so clearly. And I think a point that a lot of people have made over the years is that, on the one hand, writing about science and writing about specific nuances of engineering and science, it does get very technical, but the flow of ideas should be completely comprehensible to any interested or educated reader. All right, so here you see they do, some details about what they did. Okay, they injected such and such, they developed this system. And then in sentence 4, it says they evaluated the therapeutic efficacy using rats with osteoporosis. Now, let's look at sentence 5, maybe sentence 6 as well, and figure out what's a little different here. So what are they doing here? So it says, upon subcutaneous administration, the MPs undergo a phase transition, leaching out the NO donor and generating NO bubbles that are instantly covered by a layer of tightly packed CA surfactant molecules, forming micellar depots, if I'm pronouncing that right. What are they doing in that sentence? What's happening in that sentence? So take a look at it. So, okay, we've set up the methodology. What is this sentence actually telling us?
It's like how they're going to conduct the experiment, sort of, or like how they believe it would go.
It's why they expect their method to work.
Interesting. Yeah, and we're hearing a couple different things, which is good. That's good to hear some variation. So let's look at it more closely. So of course, you have to remember the trick of many of these science abstracts is that they're written in the active voice, kind of like as in the present tense. So you notice it said to overcome, like in sentence 3, to overcome this limitation, a system is developed. So it's kind of a weird phrasing because it's both present tense, but it's also already happened. They've already done this experiment, they've already developed it, but it's often standard, and it depends on the journal, it depends on the context, but often it's in present tense even so. So it's sort of like it's happening, but also has happened. And then in this fifth sentence that we're looking at, let's see exactly what they do. So they say, upon administration, the MPs undergo a phase transition. So I think, it relates to their methodology, but I think it's more accurate to say this is part of the results, because it's sort of like they're saying, in light of what we did, this is what actually happened. And of course, if you want to know the details, you'd read the full journal article. But you can see that they're showing you what actually happened based on sentences 3 and 4. So based on the way they set it up, and upon doing this administration, here's what happened. The MPs undergo a phase transition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this does seem to be something new, and that's probably why they're telling us about it. In other words, going to the point I think you just made, which is that this is why it might be useful for helping in clinical applications for osteoporosis. It might be helpful because of this thing that happened when they did this method. So because these bubbles formed or whatever it is, that must be something new that people haven't seen before, have never tried before in exactly this way. And then in the next sentence, they go on to describe this further. These, self-assembling depots can actively protect the NO bubbles, et cetera, so on and so forth. So that's also kind of part of the results and the implications as well, because they're saying, here's what happened and here's why we think it's important. And then just look at this last sentence in this first example. So it says, it's possible to use the concept that we've developed to expand the therapeutic effect of NO in its diverse range of clinical applications. So what you'll notice is, obviously it's concluding its implications, but it's also tying back to the motivation and the problem statement. They've literally gone back and said, in light of the fact that this could be useful treatment, but it has a problem, we've developed a method. Our method actually gives some possible applications that now will allow us to better use NO as a therapeutic method. So it all kind of ties back together. But I think you'll see very clearly that it follows this flow. And I think it's going to be clear when we look at the next example, which is a little bit different, that this flow is much more kind of universally relatable, I guess you could say, to any reader. We can all follow it. We can all see the process. So with that in mind, let's look at example number 2. And since I have it, I'll put it up here in this format as well so you can see it broken down. Sorry, before we go on, let me just point out, you can do the exact word count. I can't recall off the top of my head, but it was like 156 words, something like that, for that first abstract. So when you hear 150 word, 200 word abstract, this is what you're looking at. It's this range. And you'll notice it's 7 sentences. Now, some of them are fairly long, some of them are shorter, but it is 7 sentences. The next one is only 5 sentences. And let's see what happens in this one. So again, take a look at it, read it, try to see where these different components fall. Yeah.
Before we move on, maybe this is more semantic, but when I was reading it, it didn't feel like there was a part where they really discussed the results. Like 5 and 6 sort of go into, I guess, like the theory behind why they expect their method to work, but I would expect like a sentence or two that would say like, this had a significant effect, or like we observed in rats that this affected the osteoporosis.
That's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, you'll notice, even in the 3 examples we have here, there's a bit of variety in the distribution of the components. To some extent, you could say they're putting more emphasis on, maybe you could say they're putting more emphasis on the context and the basic method that they're applying. And maybe, I don't know, maybe the results weren't numerically interesting, like they couldn't say something like, we saw a blank % decrease that was really notable. So maybe that's true. Maybe there wasn't something along those lines, and that's why they didn't bother to put that in this abstract. But at the same time, you're right. The results here are perhaps the most abstract part. They're kind of talking about what happened, but they're not really talking about something concrete that we can all wrap our minds around. So it's an interesting question. I'd be interested now to look at the full article and see, how well it matches what's in the article. Great point, though. And we'll see how that compares in the next one as well. But yeah, I think one thing you'll notice, and I think the best way to kind of get a better feel is to find journals that are reputable in your field, go through some articles, see a variety of abstracts and see how they compare to one another. Because you'll see variation. They're not all as good as the others. Not all abstracts, even in a highly reputed journal, are going to be strong or going to be maximally strong. Because I think you're right. I mean, they could have done a little differently, and maybe for us at least, non-experts, it would come across more strongly or more gripping. I appreciate that point. Let's take a look at the next one, see what we see. Oh, I'm sorry, and I will, just for convenience, I'll show you. You probably can't read it very well, but here it is on the sentence by sentence level. Okay, so for the sake of time, we'll start taking a look at this one. So first off, just by comparison, was this one as easy to follow for most of you? Yeah, I would have to agree 100%. Much harder to follow. Even I think trying to break down the components is a little bit trickier because this seems to be a different, almost like a different kind of article than the first one. Now these actually are, I forgot I didn't put the citations on here for you. I have them on my slides, which I didn't show you. These are both, these first two we're looking at, these are both in like material science or something like that. And I think they're from the same, these two are from the same article. This is the title of the piece. It's just called PLGA, spherical nucleic acids. Now, there are a couple of things you might know. One is, it may well be that just given the nature of the journal, it's just the kind of thing that you'd find in that journal. It's the kind of article you'd find there, and thus maybe it's just more expected that you'd have something like this. Now, just at a very basic level, from the first sentence, you can at least figure out what it is that was done. What is it that was done? Summarize it. You don't have to explain it. Like, what is the thing that they did? I'm sorry?
You said in the first sentence?
Yeah. What is the
report?
There's a new something.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. I mean, those are both part of it, exactly. So there's some new thing. I think that is probably the most important piece that they seem to be contributing. They contributed some new class. They're looking at or evaluating or exploring some new thing. They're reporting on it. Now, you'll notice almost immediately it's not clear. Could anybody, well, I shouldn't say that. Did anybody figure out what is the problem or the motivation? Because that's, for my mind, the hardest part to come by here. You can kind of get pieces of it, but you can't quite tell from the abstract alone.
Is it the last two sentences?
So let's see. Yeah.
It's a drug delivery system.
Yes.
Right. And then evaluating its drug delivery capabilities.
Yeah, and I think you're right about the last two sentences. That's where they actually start to explain what this might be used for. So it starts with kind of the method, and I mean, I guess you could say just the fact that it's new is part of the motivation, that in this field, that's of itself something of interest. But they haven't given a context for where this fits in, even within the field. And so I imagine even somebody who's well-versed in this literature would actually be a little bit unsure where they're going in the first couple sentences. And as you can see, comparing it even to the previous one, that's a problem, because here we could all follow, what does this connect to? How did they go at the issue? What did they find? To some extent, that was a little murkier. And then what do they do with their potential results? Here it's trickier. Now, again, I think the pieces are mostly there, but you can see they're not laid out in this straightforward way that we just saw. And it makes a big difference in interpretability or comprehensibility. I do think you're right. We get some pieces at the end about therapeutics, but in theory, they could have started out with something that would have helped set the stage. Even if it's not about therapeutics, even if that's just kind of like a further implication, they should have at least started with something like, why is it that you're looking for a new class of these? What is the relationship to other previous work that's been done? So there's a lot of room here to improve, I think, even though it's obviously a well-written paragraph from a reputable journal. All right, because I want to end on a more straightforward note, let's go to the third example, which I think you'll find a little bit more straightforward. And again, I want you to break it down in terms of these components. This one, the article title is Sensor Radar for Object Tracking. And again, I'll put up the breakdown so you can look at that as well. All right, so before we look at these components, I actually wanted to go back to a point I'd made previously and talk about how this is applicable here. I mentioned that it can be helpful to make sure you're using keywords and phrases that align with the intended audience and purpose. So we could look at all three of these examples in this context, but here, what are some keywords or phrases that jump out at you that seem to speak to who they're interested in targeting, if that makes sense? What are the things that seem to jump out as far as the topics being covered, the implications, all of that? And there are many. So, I mean, there's a lot of right answers, but what do you notice? What are some keywords that they seem to call attention to?
Internet of Things.
Yeah, sure. Internet of Things. Yeah, absolutely. That's a buzzword that has, I mean, really broad applicability even in the general public. I mean, people are starting to use that term. So that, sorry?
I was saying radio imaging.
Absolutely. Yes. So again, those are kind of two different levels. Because on the one hand, Internet of Things is pretty, I wouldn't say universally understood now, but it's pretty widely understood, even in the general public. So that speaks to this bigger, who am I targeting? Who would be interested in this? Who benefits from this? And then which term did you use?
You said radio imaging.
Yes, radio imaging. So now more within the field itself, it's sort of like, well, what area are we working at? Well, we're looking at radio imaging. And they use a lot of variations. They talk about sensor networks, radio sensors. These are all kind of keywords. So if you imagine pulling out from this just some keywords that can be put in like a search database, those would be some of them. You'd put Internet of Things, sensor networks, radio imaging. These are the things to which that this research relates to. And you can see that as you read through it, they jump out in virtually every sentence. They also point out a couple of other important points, like they talk about in the second sentence, when objects are not equipped with dedicated tags, when they're non-collaborative. So non-collaborative seems to be an important subset in the research that you might be dealing with. Okay, so that's why I just wanted to point out here that the use of those keywords is pretty pronounced and straightforward. Now, how did you map some of these pieces onto it? I'll just keep it more open. Pick one of these and where did you see it being described? Or do you want to comment on how they did it? I mean, either way is fine. But at the minimum, map it on for us. Where did you see those things being applied?
I feel like the conclusion came before the results. Because the results is in the last sentence.
Very interesting point. Yes, I think the results here are interesting, and it's kind of similar to the first article insofar as it doesn't really tell us very much at all about exactly what they came up with. It doesn't give us any numerical sense. And you might even argue that they're not strong enough with the way they phrase this, because they say experimental results with actual UWB signals in indoor environments confirm the sensor radar's potential. So, I mean, how strong are they then? Are they stronger than previous models that have been applied? Are they, it sounds like it might actually be a fairly muted conclusion. It's not like they're saying there's a strong potential or there's, a major possibility for improvements or something like that. So it's an interesting question. And depending on the results, they either are understating it because maybe there is more to be said, or they're trying to keep it kind of level because it's not necessarily a revolutionary breakthrough, but kind of a more incremental breakthrough. Maybe it's not going to sound that impressive to say we saw a 1.5% improvement. So that's an interesting point, that the way the results are often relayed in the abstract, it can be pretty broad, it can be pretty abstract. But it still tells you what, I should say this, the other way of looking at it is it tells you what you're going to get if you read the full article, right? So we now know clearly they did such and such, such and such, and if you read this, it's going to talk about how their experimental results played out. So it tells the reader what they're going to get. It's sort of like it's to get your attention, to get your interest, to make you want to read more. So in that sense, it's quite compelling because it makes you say, oh, that's interesting. Their results confirm this. I want to see how they actually did that. Now, before we say a little bit more about this, it is important to note it's going to vary based on your audience, right? And it's going to vary based on where you're at in your career and in your research. Because it may well be if you're applying for funding from, say, NSF or some other federal agency, and you're asking for a lot of money to do certain research. you have to make it sound really exciting, right? You wouldn't want to just say, well, I hope we can confirm that there's some potential. They're going to say, well, okay, that's fine, but someone else just promised us, a 50% improvement. I mean, maybe that's too much, but they promised something more concrete. And so maybe that in the context of your grant proposal or in requesting money, you're looking for some more specific, concrete numbers you can give them as far as what you project, what you expect, and then you have to, of course, deliver that, but at least you're giving them something more concrete. Maybe it's in the context of the journal that this is published in. It's more important to talk about what their new method was. And the results sure are going to be important, and the exact numerical variants that occur because that are important. But it's more important to actually talk about what they're doing and what the context is for what they're doing. So again, you can think about that. How does it differ by audience or by the context of the writing? Now, let's look at the first sentence. Now, I mean, what would you say as far as this mapping onto these motivation, problem, method, approach, results? Precise localization, tracking, and moving objects is of great interest for a variety of emerging applications, including the Internet of Things. What does that strike you as? Yeah, motivation, I'd say absolutely. And there are a couple of things in it that are really kind of keywords for motivation. So, yeah, exactly. If you say is of great interest to or for, you're making it clear that this has applications in X, Y, and Z. So that phrase really just jumps right out at you as far as setting up motivation or the background for this, the background context. You'll also know, I just want to point this out, you'll notice there is kind of like a circular pattern in these components because motivation is almost always going to be tied to implications because the implications are going to hopefully address some of those motivating areas. So it connects back to itself when it's done well. And so we would expect then the implication of this project would be to improve what it says in the first sentence, precise localization and tracking, because that can be helpful in applications such as Internet of Things applications. So we expect the implications of this research to speak to that motivation, if that makes sense. Yeah, I think it's fairly straightforward. They talk about methods. One thing I want to point out with methods, and you saw this, I think, it was harder to see in the second one, but it's certainly clear in this one and maybe in the first one as well. Let's see what they do here. I want you to see what you make of this. So it says the localization, this is sentence 2, the localization and tracking tasks are challenging in harsh wireless environments. That's still speaking to the problem, right? That's telling us there's a problem that hasn't fully been addressed. But now look at sentence 3. The problem of detecting, localizing, and tracking non-collaborative objects within a limited area has often been undertaken by exploiting a network of radio sensors, scanning the zone of interest through wideband radio signals to create a radio image of the objects. Now, the part that I want to draw your attention to is where it says has often been. So what is that? What is that? What is that sentence doing or telling us? So the problem of such and such has often been undertaken by radio imaging. What is that telling us? If that makes sense. Absolutely. Anybody else want to piggyback off of that, or were you say something similar? Yeah, that's exactly right. I think you're both hitting on it, but I want to make it explicit. That's exactly it. So it's, yeah.
Basically showing that didn't work before. And that's why they're trying something different.
Well, let's see, because we'll see what they say they're doing, right? Let's see. But at the minimum, it is talking about past methods. So, right, like let's say you're just reading it for the first time and you haven't gone past it. You could say, yeah, they're telling us something about what's been done previously. So it's kind of like a mini, we could call it literature review, or it's speaking to what's been done previously, right? And that's kind of an interesting move that we didn't really see maybe in the same exact way in those other two. So they're actually pointing out, they're drawing attention to the fact that this has been used, something like this has been used, this radio imaging or what have you. And you might have expected it, as I think I did when I first looked at it, to go the way you were just saying, that it would go in a different direction, say, that's been tried, we're going to do this. It actually looks like they're saying we are doing a different variation of that, right? It seems like they're saying we are doing radio imaging. And in fact, what this paper presents in sentence 4, it says this paper presents a sensor network for radio imaging, along with all the signal processing steps necessary to achieve high accuracy tracking in harsh environments. So it's sort of like they're saying, yes, we are doing a radio imaging model, but we're going to show you the full model. Like they're saying, yeah, people have used radio imaging as a method, but we're going to dive into a sensor network for radio imaging with all the components, and it's going to be effective at high accuracy object tracking in harsh environments. So it's sort of, they're kind of showing they're extending from previous work, right, in the abstract. Now, obviously, if you read a full journal article, it's going to have introduction and background and or literature review, which really go into detail on what's been done previously. But it's interesting to note that even here, they felt like that was a key piece that they want to include as one of their 6 sentences, right? That's sufficiently important that they want to draw your attention to it. And it might well be that it's kind of in the context of that point I was making about keywords and phrases. It might be that for readers of this journal, they want to get your attention if you're working on radio imaging, sensor networks. That's the group that they want to share this research with. So it might be that that's why they actually put more emphasis on that this is what's been done previously. We're doing another version of this. And they keep using those keywords and phrases: sensor network, radio imaging, radio signals, radio image, so on and so forth. Now they do then go on to describe something a little different. In sentence 5, you could say they start to give a little more information about what's different, what's new. The described sensor radar is based on the impulse radio, ultra wideband technology, et cetera, and they talk about why that incorporates very short duration pulses. So that maybe that's new. Maybe that exact configuration is what's part of what's new. But now let's look again. I think we touched on it a little bit, but let's now look at this, the final sentence, 6th sentence. Experimental results with actual UWB signals in indoor environments confirm the sensor radar's potential in IoT applications. And this is what was mentioned earlier, that really in this one it's kind of out of order because the results are not concretely spoken of at all. They don't say anything about what they found except to say that it confirmed their potential. They just say that experimental results kind of were conducted, right? And so it's another case where you'd really have to read the whole article to get that level of detail. But it seems like what they're doing is they're trying to get your attention if you're interested in these areas. And they're kind of saying if you're interested in radio imaging or models for sensor networks, you know, you're going to be interested in our article because we talk about a new or a comprehensive model for doing those things. Okay, so looking at these 3 examples, are you starting to see some commonalities, some differences? Is it starting to make sense? And I guess my biggest takeaway for you would be this. I would say, if nothing else, if you're asked to write a research abstract, perhaps the easiest starting point would be to look at something like this or some variation of this, these components, and use it as a literal checklist. Start with the motivation and problem statement. Write a sentence about the background motivation. Write a sentence about the problem statement. Write maybe a couple sentences about your methods, a sentence about your results or some aspect of your results, and 1 sentence about your conclusions and implications. And there you go, you have yourself a research abstract. So, you know what I mean? If nothing else, you can use that as a template, a very basic template, but one that actually maps pretty well onto some really nicely written abstracts. And what you may have noticed in the second abstract is perhaps where there's room to do a little bit more of that. It would have been helpful if they set it up a little more clearly at the outset, so we knew before we got halfway through what it's actually doing or what's novel about it or what it's connected to. That it's, you know, in fact about maybe a drug delivery system. Those are my takeaways. Does anybody have any questions, thoughts, comments? I have a couple more questions for you, but does anybody have any thoughts, questions on the content covered? Or other observations, anything? It's okay if you don't. So let me ask you, in the context of this research experience that you're doing, so what, are you all doing your own independent research projects? Is that how it's working? So you're working with faculty members, developing a project and conducting that project? Now, are you all in different fields or similar fields? I know some are in more computer modeling. What fields are you in? Can you call out a couple names? Like, are you all in electrical engineering, computer engineering, varied?
Computer science.
Computer engineering.
Mechanical engineering.
Okay, good. Yeah, so it's a nice spread. So it covers a little bit of breadth. So by the end of this program, I'm assuming you'll have you've done some work on a project, you're going to write it up in some way, I think what Dr. Ram was saying was something like you'll be expected to or strongly encouraged to do some kind of publication or presentation opportunity out of it, right? Yeah, so by the end of what you're going to do then, you will certainly have all these pieces, right? You might already have some of them right now. You might say, I know what my motivation is. I developed that from the outside. I know what strikes me as interesting. I know what my problem is. So you could actually do this already. You could sketch out, a couple examples of a one-sentence summary of your problem statement. That's a good exercise. If you try to do it a couple different ways, say, what is my problem? Just sit down at the computer, type it out. Say, what is my problem in one sentence that I'm trying to address? Type it out. You might not like it at first. It might not be very clean. It might not be, grammatically perfect, but you're going to get some ideas on the page. And that goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. So there are two pieces to becoming a better writer. One is you have to actually study writing. And by that I mean you read stuff, you find stuff that's good and you read it. Because just you kind of naturally imbibe some of the positive qualities of good writing as you read it. You look for examples that are going to be relevant to you. So again, find a journal that's relevant to your field. If you don't really know for sure which are the best journals in your field, speak to your mentor, speak to your advisors about it. Say, where should I go to get the best written, the clearest, most straightforward, best composed journal articles in my field? And maybe they can tell you a couple examples. Now pull up that journal, look through a couple articles, look at the abstracts, read them, see what's good about them, see what's bad about them. You can critique them. As I said, even if people who are very well established in their careers or even regarded as very strong writers always have room to improve. That's the nature of writing. It's kind of a perpetual process. There's no height, there's no ceiling that you reach. Where there's a limit. So that's what I'm talking about by studying writing. Reading good stuff. Also breaking it down. So what we did today was an example of trying to actually break it down. So now that you've read something, you get it, but how does it work? In the same way that you're interested in this in technical areas, break down a piece of writing into its components. What makes this work? What makes this work more successfully or less successfully? And then of course the other piece, as I said, is practicing writing. You have to write to get better at writing. So that's why I say, if you force yourself to do a little bit of writing now and again every week, by the time you get to the end, you're really ready to put some useful material on the page. Hope you found this useful. I hope you can take some of this away with you. If you have any questions, do let me know. But I think that'll conclude this session for today. Thank you. And I don't know do you know where you're going next? Is Dr. Ram supposed to come back for you, or are you just going to the lab? Okay. It was a pleasure having you. We're glad to have you here on campus. And yeah, I really hope you take a lot from not just this session, but from this experience. It's really amazing opportunity. Enjoy.